So we had a good discussion there. We didn't record the sort of discussion so we could sort of freely chat about that. But now we're back into some of the content. Now I want to thank those who have got their assignments in. Some of you are still just finalising it. I think they're due at the end of today. So do that. But if you are still struggling a little bit to understand this or get your head around it, feel free to reach out and get that support with a bit of one-on-one coaching from one of our team. Otherwise, pop it in. You'll get marked. You'll get some feedback, and that's really important part of the training and the learning is read that feedback, understand it, get your head around it. There are some new sort of ways of looking at things here with the exposure and likelihood and severity, and as I said to Sandeep there, in different industries and in different ways. We've looked at road safety in the past. We've used those terms for slightly different things. So it's important to start to get our head around this and be fairly consistent as we go. So in the sort of assignments there that I had a quick flick through some of the ones that had come in just to see how people were going, getting their head around this. I generally found that most people were pretty good at understanding like severity, that heavily influenced by the speed of the bullet vehicle, the angle that the crash will happen. This is passenger vehicle. The severity of roadside hazards. Are we talking about a power pole, which we call a point source hazard, or are we talking about hitting a wall or an embankment or the like, which will be less severe? Or are we talking about hitting a barrier system, which again will be less severe, like even less severe than that? So we think about the severity of crashes. And then, of course, if we have pedestrians or cyclists, we're thinking about the speed of the vehicle that strikes the pedestrian or cyclist. That's going to be the big influencer on the severity of crash, because the angles don't play as much role when we're talking about vulnerable road users. And we'll be digging into vulnerable road users coming up. And we'll have a look at motorcyclists, which sort of sit somewhere in between that passenger vehicle and the pedestrian and cyclist for a number of reasons, which I'll get to. Generally, people were pretty good also at the likelihood of crashes, which was influenced by a whole lot of things. And you think about, if you say to yourself, yeah, that's going to increase the chance of a crash, or that's like it's probably sits in the likelihood. So it could be the signs, the line marking, the intersection control, like if it's a passively controlled intersection like the one Sandeep put up, which was a stop control. So it really gives that driver the opportunity to make the decision as to when they think it's safe to go or not. And that's going to increase the likelihood of crashes as opposed to a signalized or a roundabout where it's a bit more, well, roundabouts, they're still making that choice, but it's a much simpler choice to make. So surface conditions, lighting, all these things influencing the likelihood of crashes. Exposure was the one that tripped people up a little bit. And it's because, as I mentioned, it's been used as a word for different things. But I just want you to think numbers. Just think numbers. Number of cars, number of pedestrians, number of motorcyclists, exposure. I wish actually in the Safe System Assessment Framework that Austroads had just called it the number. Number of pedestrians, number of cyclists, number of motorcyclists, number of cars, or number of vehicles. Then the likelihood of crash for any individual, and then how bad it's going to be. But it was called exposure. And just back to what I showed in module 1 there. I mean, blocking off the intersection would eliminate the exposure. And it practically is a challenge a lot of the time to block it off. This one was a level crossing that got blocked off with a big mound of dirt, a bit hard to see there. And they just closed the level crossing essentially. But that would influence the exposure because 0 is the number that is now exposed to that. But also that segregation and taking one road user group, the vulnerable road user group, and separating it from that vehicle traffic. They're no longer exposed. Now, we're starting to build this jigsaw puzzle of what is a safe system assessment. So we're starting out with lots of these safe system principles and ways of thinking about things and piecing this puzzle together. There are some definitions of these different exposure, likelihood, and severity, which this one, refers to which road users, what numbers are using the road, and thus exposed to potential crash. The measure of exposure include AADT, so annual average daily traffic, side road traffic volumes, number of motorcyclists, number of cyclists, number of pedestrians. So that's sort of the definition there. But I wanted to just throw out one other example, which some people get a little bit confused by, and I'll just do it now. So if we had a road here, for example, and we had pedestrians, so I do use a dotted line for pedestrians, crossing the road, right? The number of pedestrians that cross is the exposure of pedestrians to crashes. The distance that they cross is a likelihood factor under a safe system assessment. Now, that's one that in the past it's been used differently because they sort of talk about the length of time exposed to crash potential. But in a safe system assessment, in order for us not to double count risk, essentially, we say that's the number is the exposure. The distance influences part of the likelihood of crash. So if we were to put some curb out stands or curb build outs, depending on which country you come from or which state, so we lessen the distance that they have to cross, that's going to influence likelihood of crash. You got not exposure, okay? Because it's still going to be the same number crossing, less likely to crash. Now, if we are able to get some speed reduction associated with our curb out stands and the narrowing effect, that might influence severity and likelihood a bit. But I want you to think about it like that. We're not going to influence exposure unless we somehow changed the number of pedestrians crossing or the number of vehicles coming through. So points come in there. So there's a few things I might have to talk to. Wouldn't segregation, bicycle lane example, also reduce the likelihood? Well, in a traditional risk sense, you would say it reduces the likelihood of crashes. But if we have, under a safe system assessment, if we had sort of, let's put a bike lane on here, so we've got this bike lane and we've got traffic lane, just separated by a white line. The exposure of bikes to crashes is the number of bikes. The number of vehicles actually influences the likelihood of bike crashes. I don't want to confuse people at this stage. So let's just stick to bikes. So we've got bikes. The number of bikes is the exposure. If we then build a fully segregated facility, right, and we move the bikes onto there, the exposure on this section goes down because there's less bikes on there, right? So it's about the numbers that they're not exposed to that crash from passenger vehicles. Okay, there might be some other crash types that the bikes are exposed to up here, they're running off the path or striking a pedestrian or these sort of things. But that vehicle that leaves their lane, enters the bike lane, they're not exposed to that anymore, assuming we've got, really good separation distance or some sort of physical barrier system through there. So I hope that sort of helps a little bit there. Let's have a look at some other questions or comments that have come in. What about reducing traffic lanes from 2 to 1 to assist pedestrians? Okay, so that, yep, that would, okay, so if we had a road, these are great questions, thank you. So we had a road and it maybe had four lanes or something like that, big road, pedestrian crossing here has got quite a likelihood of crash. There's multiple lanes to cross. There's a long distance. We've got possible, dynamic visual obstruction again, a vehicle there, vehicle here, pedestrian crossing here, sight line sort of blocked to that pedestrian. So there's quite a bit going on there in terms of the likelihood of crash. The severity is going to be dictated by the speed of these vehicles. The exposure is going to be the number of pedestrians. If we were to then reduce the number of lanes here and say, well, we're going to take out some lanes, we're going to do some wonderful greenery here and greenery here. And now we've just got this pedestrians sort of crossing from here, only having to cross 2 lanes, or even 1 lane if you narrowed it down, we would reduce the likelihood of crash because they don't have as much time on the road. It's less complicated. It's an easier crossing choice. Would we influence the exposure to pedestrian crashes? No, unless it somehow changed the number of pedestrians that decided to cross. Okay, you're not going to fit as many vehicles through, are you? If you've narrowed it down to, say, 1 lane, yeah, and that will be exposure of vehicles to crashes, the different vehicle crash types, and it'll actually lessen the likelihood of pedestrian crashes. We're going to keep practicing this as it's something to get your head around a little bit. We've produced, for those hanging around to do safe system assessing, like the actual technique of it and how you fill it all out, you'll see that the scoring can get a little bit nuanced. So we've got these fact sheets to support. There's one in there on bicycle facilities, like we were talking about, how you define exposure or likelihood or severity for some of these things. There's a bit to it, but I hope you're starting to piece that together in your mind. The assignment will help, and then the next exercise will help as well. Okay, I think there's a few questions coming in. This is good. We want people to get clarity on this. Let's have a look. While your road user type influences already, there's also exposure, or is it just the fact that they exist at all rather than type that matters? Okay. Yeah, so the vulnerable road users, I mean, the fact that you have the vulnerable road users there means the severity of crashes involving them is going to be higher. So the fact that they're there is really the meaning that the severity will be higher for those crash types. For exposure, if a channelized right turn is installed, would it be correct to say that the exposure is reduced only for rear end crashes for stationary vehicles waiting to turn right? Okay. So you'll see as we get further into the safe system assessing that rear end crashes are not their own specific crash type to deal with. But I would say most likely not, because we don't think of exposure reduction. So if you've got, you've created some sort of right turn facility, there is usually still an exposure to rear end crashes. It's just far less likely to happen because a vehicle traveling along here has a free run through, and the vehicle waiting to turn right there is sort of out of their way. But if this vehicle is distracted or for some reason, they can still sort of fairly easily enter in and rear end crash them. It's going to be far less likely for that to happen, but it's still sort of within the reasonable realms of possibility. So we would sort of think about that as a very significant reduction in the likelihood of rear end crashes. But I'm still reluctant to say it would be a change in the exposure to rear end crashes. Hope that makes sense. Okay, what else we got here? Other industries such as aviation, risk analysis, frequency, severity, occurrence. They refer to exposure as frequency, number of events. Yeah, so that's I think would have helped if Austrades had sort of gone down a bit of that track, bit of uniformity, because that maybe explains things a little bit better. So thank you. Does exposure have to be defined separately for each crash type? In some road layouts, driver might be exposed to risk of run-off road crash, but not exposed to risk of vehicle-to-vehicle crash. Yeah, so we do, when we get to the safe system assessment, we analyze distinctly for crash types. So it may be, well, I mean, sometimes you might do a safe system assessment of a length of road that doesn't have any intersection. So you're not, then there's no exposure to intersection crashes. So, yeah, we'll put a 0 for exposure to intersection crashes, and then we would think about, the exposure to run-off road crashes. So we sort of chop this up. Thank you for all those questions. That's good. So it's about getting this clarity. We will take a little break shortly to have a stretch, but I will start our discussion about vulnerable road users, and we did spend those first 2 modules with a little bit more focus on passenger vehicle crashes, trying to establish some of the fundamentals of this thinking. And now I'm going to delve into vulnerable road users. To do that, connecting movement and place thinking with safe system thinking is pretty important. We're going to talk then about the characteristics of vulnerable road users and ways that we can create road environments and system elements that give us high alignment with safe system principles for different vulnerable road users. And we will, of course, be talking about exposure, likelihood, and severity. Okay, so those who aren't familiar with the movement and place concept, well, I'm going to explain it at a very sort of simple level. There's courses you can do around Australia on movement and place, and you can spend a few days sort of digging into the movement and place concept. But at a very sort of simplified level, I'm going to use this old Sydney movement and place framework. And it says, okay, a road or a street can play a movement function, and that's the movement of people and goods, or it can provide a place function. And that is sort of defined as a place for people to congregate, to trade, to interact, to socialize. That's the sort of place value of an area. Now, of course, roads and streets originated usually as movement corridors and the place built around them. But under these frameworks, we're really now starting to say, no, these streets and some of these roads are an important place for people in our whole strategic planning of the city or the area we're talking about. And so you can then start to categorize any road or street for its amount of movement requirement or its amount of place requirement or what you aspire to get out of this. So there are some obvious ones like the motorways, which is on here, that is just a movement corridor. Now, I don't want you to think of movement corridors as just the movement of vehicles. No, it's the movement of people and goods. And that could be done on bikes, in public transport, on cars, trucks, whatever it is, but it's about the movement through this area. So that could equally be a dedicated cycleway, for example. I've got this one just happened to have motorway there. Down the other end, you've got these really high place value areas, which are your malls. They're about having people there with cafes and catching up and markets. And it's not about moving people through this area or moving people and goods through this area as quickly as we can. It's about that place value of the area. And so you can see this one's divided up into these places for people, the local streets, movement corridors, and vibrant streets being those areas which are often very challenging because they want high movement through the area of people and goods, but they also want high place value, and it becomes a bit of a challenge. That's the most challenging category to think about what we can do to improve this area from a safety perspective, because there's multiple competing objectives. So why, as sort of safe system practitioners or safe system assessors, are we sort of caring about this? Well, the reason we really care about it is that you can create safe system environments in any of these categories, using different techniques and different infrastructure and different characteristics. But if you can also do things to get better alignment with safe system principles that go against this. So let me sort of explain that. If you had a high movement corridor or an area you're really trying to create higher movement, it's not got a lot of place value, but you do local area traffic management, speed humps, bring speeds right down to 20 kilometers an hour or so for if it's a vehicle, you're really impacting on the movement of that area. Likewise, down here, if you've got an area you want as place for people and you put continuous barrier systems down the outside of the road and the like, you've eroded the place value of the area. Yes, both of those will probably give you better alignment with safe system principles, but they don't align with the strategic planning of that, strategic transport planning of that area. So when we do a safe system assessment, we're sort of looking, what is the strategic objective of this area, this road, this route? And then what can we recommend that aligns highly with safe system principles, but also facilitates that strategic function? So we've got the, these places for people, and well, I popped this one up. Sort of COVID actually helped clarify a lot of place for people for some streets and roads where they really activated them and made them places for people where they're a bit unclear at one point. But I thought we could do a couple of little exercises. Maybe we'll do this one, then I'll do one, and then I'll leave one up while we go have our stretch and get our coffee and the like. But here's an area, and I want you to imagine, okay, it's an artistic impression, so take it with a grain of salt. But I want us to say, okay, this is a place for people. It's been defined here as in the place for people category. It's currently 40 kilometers an hour speed limit. It's got lots of vehicles, buses, and you can see there, that's sort of what it is. I want you in the chat to type in things that you could change here that would make it more a place for people, would make it better safe system aligned. And the little kicker here, I want you to tell me whether that influences exposure or likelihood or severity or a combination? So think about, what do you think could change here? And so I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Pop it into the chat. I'm just going to have a look here and see if there's anything else that I need to deal with. Yeah. So Faisal's made a really good comment. It's not like movement in place can change during time of day. A really, really important point, and it can change the road users that are there as well. So that's sort of the smart roads theory where you can sort of alter this by time of day as well. Okay, seeing a few ideas come in. Don't remember to put in your exposure or likelihood or severity. That's what we want to be seeing. We're practicing that as well. Okay, this is really good. Thank you, everyone, for popping stuff in there. Okay, so everything I'm seeing coming in now is going to improve alignment with safe system principles. So well done there. Okay, so I'm going to give a prize out here to Sarah there for the ultimate target for place function, pedestrianize the area. And that's right. And what we would actually say, depending, it would either influence exposure because we wouldn't have any vehicles in there, so we wouldn't have that exposure to crashes, or it would influence the likelihood and severity down significantly. So that's right. The first, if you ever get asked to sort of assess an area and it's down in the place for people, you really should be questioning, should we have cars in there at all? Should we have vehicles in there at all? Buses, trucks? Like, can we just make it a fully pedestrianized area? If that's not a possibility, then we get into what we're seeing from a lot of the comments that came in, which are really some really good ones. So traffic calming, absolutely. So reducing the likelihood and severity of crashes. Probably not exposure unless it's going to change the number of vehicles through it. I think with some traffic modeling, you might discover it might change that a little bit, but we don't want to be predicting that too much. So when we get into providing things like off-street cycle paths and the like, that's really a little bit more in the movement because we're creating these dedicated movement corridors now. When you're heavily down in the place area, it's a bit more about sort of that interaction, that mixing, these low speed environments. So we're going to try and get lower than this. As the movement requirement starts to increase, that's when these separations start to become something you're looking at. And that's where, we create the dedicated crossing facilities and the like. So it's got to have more of a movement requirement in order to put a pedestrian crossing there because so I've seen wombat crossings and pedestrian crossing features and the like in there. I mean, by doing that, if we put a pedestrian crossing and, design that all up and maybe hopefully raised it and the like, that's really said, this is a movement corridor for cars, pedestrians, you all have to cross there. So it's naturally got more movement function associated with it. Yeah, so Jim's put an interesting one there. And the way Jim's analyzed it, I think, is really good, which is to say, okay, one-way system. And put likelihood, and I'd agree with that. So you're less likely to crash on a one-way system because it's easier, it's less complicated. You know which way to look if you're crossing the road or if you're coming out of a side road. So it is likelihood. But then Jim also clarified it with could be exposure if there's less vehicles. And that is a big tick, if there's less vehicles. So let's give Jim a prize for really honing in on that exposure, likelihood, severity thinking, which is what we're after. Now, there's lots of come in that I'm not going to get to everybody's. So Barnaby's put in HPAA, which is high pedestrian activity area, reduces severity and likelihood. And that's another big tick there. So Barnaby can have a prize as well, because if we can get these speed environments down, there's less chance of a crash because people have more time to see, to evade, to brake and these sort of things. If something happens, it's at lower speed. Now, of course, we do like to see those complemented with, good local area traffic management if possible and making sure those speeds are down. Okay, I might keep ticking along here. I did promise you'd get a stretch break and the like shortly. Now, I put up here just again, these are artistic impressions, so take it all with a grain of salt. But you can see that if you are creating place for people out of those sorts of environments, you're really trying to either pedestrianize the whole area or increase the area for pedestrians to hang out, to trade, to socialize, to interact. Now, this one, it's got a sort of a pedestrian crossing there. You can make this a shared zone easily. It's probably going to have less vehicles, but I won't make that prediction as a safe system assessor. I'll wait till I see what traffic modeling says about, what the new vehicle volumes might be associated with something like this. But you can immediately see this is much better as a place for people, isn't it? To hang out, to trade, have a coffee, drink, play with kids, whatever. It's going to be safer. It's going to have less likelihood of crash, less severity of crash because speeds are down. It's one way. The exposure will be dependent on the number of vehicles that sort of go through that. As the movement demand comes up, that's where we start to see this separation of facilities. You can see now, so the bike facility, the separated bike facility, that's about moving people through that area on their bikes, isn't it? Same with the area for buses there and cars as well. It's about moving those through. So we've started to rise up in that movement requirement. Local streets category, because it's low place value, it's low movement requirement. Now, you don't go out and tell the residents of the local streets that we think of their street as low place value, because place is that whole of community place in, as I talked about, trade, socializing, interacting, all of that sort of stuff. But when you are in these categories, you can really start to reduce the speeds of vehicles through because of that lower movement requirement. And we can look to not make it highly accessible for rat running, for people to use it as a cut through, because it's not that major movement corridor. So we can block off streets, we can put local area traffic management in. Another artistic example of that, and a little bit similar to the last one there, you can see it's a slower area. I'm going to jump onto this one, and what we're going to do is I'm going to explain it, and then I'm going to give you a good sort of 7 minutes or so to have a stretch, fill up your coffee, and pop a few ideas in. But this is where we're in this vibrant streets category, which is high place value. High place. We're trying to make this a real place to hang out, to trade, to go have a drink, coffee, catch up with people. But there's high movement requirement as well, trying to get people and goods through this area in one way or another. And here's our sort of street as it sits at the moment, which has got lots of lanes of traffic, 70 km/h speed. It's got this sort of pedestrian overpass up here. It's a big wide road, a bit of pedestrian fencing in the middle. I want you to do the same exercise, and as I say, it's going to be mixed with our time to have a bit of a break. But how are we going to alter this road environment to make it more aligned with that vibrant streets category? So high place and high movement of people and goods. And the changes, are they going to influence exposure or likelihood or severity? So have a look at that. And I'm going to give you 7 minutes starting now. We'll get back into it in a minute. Lots of good comments coming in, and a bit of discussion in there as well, which is good to see. So let's have a look at this environment and have a look at what some people have said. So we started off with some people looking to separate out some of the modes, and that will provide a safer facility. So separated cycle facility and the like, which may reduce the exposure and likelihood, possibly severity of some crash types. And I think that's sort of good thinking. It's likely to definitely improve the safety. Will it give us more sort of place value? Probably a little bit as well. We had some people looking to reduce the speed, which is good. So reducing the likelihood and severity of crashes. So well done there on those. And then we had quite a bit of discussion by a few people around the pedestrians and what's going on here. So there is a pedestrian overpass facility, but we've got people crossing the road. And I think the conversation was sort of nicely played out by itself. But yeah, I mean, pedestrian overpasses and underpasses are sometimes used. They can be designed really well, so they're used a lot more, but they're certainly not the most desirable facilities in a lot of situations. Now, they certainly erode place value. If you are having to move your pedestrians up and over, block them off, so putting more central barrier systems and things, it's a real eroder to place value. You would do it in an area where you really don't want place value. So there's high movement corridors. You're definitely going to separate out pedestrians and hopefully design it well enough that it's very accessible and easy to use. But that's sort of an important one to have a think about. So probably to give us better place value out of this area would be a removal of the pedestrian overpass and lowering of vehicle speed and more appropriate crossing points for pedestrians as well. What else have we got here? Yeah, so some really, so many good comments coming in here. Yeah, so dedicating some of these areas. Let's just have a look at what's sort of, again, the artistic impression. You can sort of see the increased place value, wider areas for pedestrians to walk, to hang out, to have a coffee and the like. And then your movement through the area on bikes, in buses, cars as well, and pedestrians walking through the area. Okay, it's still providing pretty good movement function for all these different modes. Now, it's quite a transformation, really, and the artistic impressions are always, you're able to do that, and it's good. We would sort of often chip away at this over time. Yeah, but we do see areas where there's increasing place value by creating some of these facilities and fostering movement of different modes as well. And it's really interesting for us to think about the exposure, likelihood, and severity allocation when we're adding things like these bike facilities or the like. Now, for me, this one, I would actually say reduces the likelihood of crashes compared to bikes riding in lane without those sort of curb separators and that area. The reason I'd say likelihood, not exposure, is just the ability for a vehicle to drift into that area. Still quite easy. It's not, they're not redirective curbs. It's not physically separated with a high, what we call a redirective curb, or a high profile barrier curb or anything like that, or an actual barrier system, or significant distance. Also, you've got those points that vehicles turn in and out, which gives us that conflict between vehicles and cyclists. But that being said, the likelihood of cyclist to vehicle crashes in these environments is far less than having the bikes mixing it with traffic or just protected by only a white line. Okay, so those movement corridors are the ones where we really are going to prioritize the movement through the area, be that in vehicles or be that with like absolute dedicated cycleways. You don't want people hanging out, trading, interacting, having their coffees and catch-ups in these environments. We're going to make them movement corridors. And in fact, they're not going to be great places to hang out and the like. That they are going to be these faster traffic routes, or they're going to be these faster cycleway areas. But these would be the environments where you might start to look to create those separation of overpasses and underpasses. You're still going to have to design them really well and make sure people, or try and encourage people to use them significantly, or create those environments where people can cross safely. Because we still need to always think about the conflict points, even if it is designated a movement corridor and it's maybe a traffic movement corridor, it does not mean we can abandon our safe system energy tolerance thinking. We have to manage the energy where there is that conflict points, like with our slowing vehicles through the right angle crash possibility of these signalized intersections or other mechanisms. So thank you all for that wonderful input, and good to see lots of people, sharing their thoughts with everyone so others can read it and see what's coming in. It's good sort of discussion. There's a few dot points sort of talking now a little bit about cyclists and pedestrians as two of our vulnerable road users, and just showing the risk associated with impacts from passenger vehicles at some speeds, which we know is going to significantly cause damage. So around that sort of 20 to 30 kilometre per hour mark is our real threshold speed for pedestrians and cyclists. And so creating these physical separations for cyclists is what we would really be aspiring towards. And there's different ways to do it. There's physical separation using barrier systems. There's physical separation using sort of the parked cars and what we call our Copenhagen style lanes, where we'd be pushing the car parking out into the road and leaving the run for the cyclists, protected away from the faster moving vehicles like this one here. I talked a bit in module 2 about the wonderful advantages of roundabouts for passenger vehicle crashes, and that's reducing the speeds of those crashes, the angles are better, lessening the conflict points. Cyclists and pedestrians don't have the best time of roundabouts usually, but there are features that can be done to make roundabouts really highly aligned with safe system principles. And this sort of Dutch-inspired roundabout is a good example of that, where we have the circulating carriageway around, so the sort of cyclist circulating carriageway, and then you've got the vehicle circulating carriageway in the middle. And a cyclist that wants to do a right turn sort of comes in, goes around, and off they go down like that. You can see the raised features, the slowing of vehicles exiting. This reduces the likelihood and severity of pedestrian and cyclist crashes, as well as vehicle crashes. So they're wonderfully aligned safe system sort of solutions for these areas. You need to have a think about which locations you're going to do this within that strategic planning context. But from that, pure, like, what is the likelihood of crash and the severity of crash for the different road users involved, we know this is highly aligned with safe system principles. So that's the Moray Street protected intersection down in South Melbourne, for those who are familiar with it. We've done some evaluations of these where we put cameras up and watched how people interacted for a few weeks, and where pedestrians went, and whether cyclists were using the facility or not, and analyze some speeds and the like, and they perform incredibly well. So quite excited for these. Two-lane roundabouts, hugely problematic though for cyclists and pedestrians, but cyclists sort of trying to do a right turn on a two-lane roundabout is a highly problematic thing. And from a strategic planning sense, we want to have a rethink if we're pushing lots of cyclists through these two-lane roundabouts. Here's some sort of artistic impressions of, or not artistic impressions, sort of concept design, I suppose, for how you might be able to do a little bit better. Certainly the Dutch, for example, would just physically grade separate here. So the cyclists would likely stay at grade, and then the roundabout would probably set up a little bit higher. So the cyclists don't have to, drive up, ride up and down. They would just get this nice flat run through, and the vehicles would have to go up and down a little bit. But a lot in Australia where we'll sort of provide that facility to try to lessen the likelihood and provide these crossing points. And here's a sort of adaptation of a diagram that tries to just generally give these concepts that if you're in very low speed environments, maybe 30 or below, maybe 20 or below, is where we can mix vulnerable road users and vehicles. If you go up above that sort of speed, we need some sort of physical separation, sort of barrier curbing, pushing the parking out. And then at the very higher speed, up here on the 70 and above, is we really have to start to look to physically provide these off-road facilities for vulnerable road users. It just doesn't work to mix, even with some curbing or the like. And before I jump onto pedestrians there, I've seen something pop in there. Do cyclists obey separation, or do some choose to ride amongst motor vehicles? And that is a really great point. Absolutely. It's a real challenge. I sort of have now, and I need to say before I say what I'm about to say, I'm a cyclist. I ride most days, but I think that there's areas where there's roads where we need to start banning cyclists, and there's roads where we need to start banning vehicles, or we really need to make these decisions about the use of the road network. So I've done safe system assessments on some of these major high-speed, 80 kilometre per hour outer suburban arterial type roads, and recommendations around separated cycle facilities, absolutely. But the challenge is there that you will get those lycra-clad training cyclists that just refuse to use that separated facility. And how do we handle that? How do we deal with that? And I don't have great answers on that. I know we've reduced the exposure to crashes, but you still leave a residual of risk there, which can be really, really challenging. And cyclists are quite a varied road user cohort, in the sense that we have young cyclists, kids riding. We have the lycra-clad, what we call the mammals, the middle-aged men in lycra. I'm probably going to put my hand up and say I'm one of those sometimes as well. We've got then cargo bikes. We've got now e-bikes emerging, and we've got utility cyclists, and all sorts of things. So it's a really challenging thing to create these environments which are catering for all of these varied road users. So Stuart's asking that question, why the 70 kilometer per hour in that diagram I was showing just before there. Well, those the 30 to the 70 have that physical separation in one mode or another, and it's probably a little around your sort of idea of lane departure risk going up with speed, and then we do have a physical separator in there. I should have been clear on that. So it's sort of a bit of a risk balance there. Yeah, David's popped in a good point. Yeah, it's amazing to see cyclists on these 100, 110 kilometer per hour roads doing their training. And they are, yeah, I mean, they're a vulnerable road user that's going to be killed or certainly seriously injured around that 30 kilometer crash, let alone at those speeds. It's just absolutely unsurvivable. So we haven't got things right from a holistic system perspective there. Pedestrians and that vulnerability for pedestrians is something significant as well. And, you know, similar 20 to 30 kilometer per hour mark, we see it go very bad very quickly above those sorts of speeds. Now, one thing I want to say is that a pedestrian crossing, so a zebra crossing, without that raised feature to it, that's not a safety feature. That will, it's not likely to reduce the likelihood of crashes too much. Oh, no, it will. It'll reduce the likelihood of crashes a bit, but the severity of crashes is so high where a vehicle misses the or doesn't slow down and a pedestrian steps out. But if we raise the feature for what we call a wombat crossing in Australia, or in New Zealand, it's just got a raised pedestrian crossing, as the one on the screen is, you'd see that we reduce the likelihood and severity of crashes. So raising these crossing points is absolutely so critical to ensuring that they actually provide a safety benefit for pedestrians, because we get that speed down. We force that speed down. There's spin-off benefits such as the accessibility. So you don't have to go down into the roadway and back up, and also pedestrians crossing are in a little bit better eye line for vehicles as well. So lots of good good options there. Now, Faisal's put in there the opposition to some of these raised features for emergency service vehicles and low vehicles like Ferraris and things, and I'm sure there's a few of those floating around Dubai. Well, this is what we need to start considering. The emergency vehicle one's interesting. Well, I did read a fair bit into this, and it doesn't significantly impact any response times or anything like that. And we've had some real support from emergency services for different raised intersections and raised crossings as well. And it will impact on the ability for vehicles to go fast through an area. And that's the point of it, I think. So, if we can get our transport planning at a strategic sense done better, but if pedestrians are crossing a road, the protection of vulnerable road users is paramount, and we should be raising it. If we've got the pedestrian crossing demand, the exposure there, it's our obligation to ensure that the severity of any incident is down. Yeah, and the crash reduction factor for wombat crossing is big. So there's ranges around 60 to 80, 85%, depending exactly where you are. The crash reduction factor for a pedestrian crossing that is not raised is 0. We give it 0, and sometimes some people advocate to give it a negative, like you will increase death and serious injury. So just think about that next time you're assessing or looking at or thinking about a pedestrian crossing without raising it. Now, there are other options. You can do speed calming on the approach or speed calming in the area to slow vehicle speeds down, but it's pretty important that we get speeds of vehicles down where there's this pedestrian crossing demand and they're actually crossing. And I'll pop this up. I mean, I just think we have known what a safe system environment for a pedestrian is for a very long time. We just haven't looked at it through the correct lens. Now, let me explain this. This is Adelaide back, that's a good few years back now, but this road was 60 kilometers per hour. And there was some workers doing electrical works in the island there. So because those workers were going to be there for a couple of weeks, the speed limit of this road went down to 25 kilometres an hour. That's the South Australian work zone speed limit. But, you know, in most other states it'd be 40, but, you know, so significant reduction in the vehicle truck speed. They put up these barricades or the barriers there, and the workers worked in there for a couple of weeks. Then they finished and they removed all those barriers. They put the speed limit back up to 60 kilometres per hour. And then about 3,000 pedestrians a day sort of stand and cross the road here. They're the same form, the physical, they withstand the same amount of force. But if they're a worker, we give them a safe system road environment. If they're just a member of the public, apparently we don't give them and we don't afford them that same level of protection. And it's really interesting, isn't it? And people sometimes say, well, the workers are concentrating on the work, so they can't see what's going on. And I say, well, the pedestrians are concentrating on their phone and they're intoxicated and they're, all of the other things. So the risk is absolutely still there. So if you have to sort of give that elevator pitch on safe system, I often just say to people, well, do you know how we think about the safety of workers and the culture we have around worker safety? Afford that same thinking and that same culture to the travelling public. And that would get us a very well-aligned safe system environment. We're getting better at it, and there's some good features. But one thing I do note for your safe system thinking is anywhere there's a public transport stop, we see about a doubling in pedestrian risk. So we've done this on a few. I did one 20 years ago, or I commissioned one 20 years ago when I was in Vic Roads, and we discovered that a tram route in Melbourne has double the pedestrian risk as a non-tram route, and that's accounting for the pedestrian activity. So we are trying to normalise it in terms of that risk rating. So of course, there's a bit more pedestrian activity on the tram routes, but it's because what do people do when their tram is coming? They run across the road. They take incredible risks, and we see that result in pedestrian death and serious injury. So if you are assessing an area and it has a public transport stop, and this works the same for rail stations, for bus stops, tram, light rail, people will take large risks to get that. And then it becomes our obligation to understand, okay, the likelihood of crash has gone up here. We need to either start to think, can we address the exposure? That's pretty hard to do without, stopping pedestrians being in the area, which is not really likely to happen. We've got to get the severity down and try to temper the likelihood again. And I think we've got wonderful options with technology of detecting public transport coming in and calming speeds or stopping vehicles at those times where we know the risk is going to be elevated, or just creating these areas where the speeds are lower in this last little bit before the public transport stop. And the raised intersections and the like, still, they're really just wonderfully aligned for safe system principles from the vehicle to vehicle, but also pedestrian crash reduction. Lots and lots of design nuances with these and how to design them and the grades of them and all sorts of bits and pieces. And just noting on this one, they use the OmniStop style bollards because you've removed the curbing, so a larger vehicle is likely to sweep around over pedestrian areas. So you need to keep that that definition a bit better. But these are reducing the likelihood and severity of crashes, and anything such as raised thresholds or even using things like roundabouts and the like to differentiate these higher pedestrian areas from these higher movement corridor areas is really important as well. The speed limit reduction, it works. I think this was a nice little diagram that I got from, I think Jeremy Woolley gave this to me he's the Centre for Automotive Safety Research, University of Adelaide, around crashes, pedestrian crashes, when the default speed limit changed in urban areas from 60 to 50. And you can see it was like a step change. That was, they weren't physically building anything different. We just saw a major step change there in the reduction in death and serious injury for the pedestrians. Okay, I'm just going to cover off motorcyclists and then hopefully give you a little bit of time to finish off your assignment if you haven't done that already, and do a quiz and get yourself all prepared, because those who are coming back, you're going to have a bigger assignment to do, and I want you to be up to speed. But motorcyclists, a really challenging road user in us getting them aligned with safe system principles when we strip it back to the core principles of the safe system of, humans make mistakes and we've got to try to manage the energy in these mistakes. Yes, we're going to do everything we can to lessen the chance of crash, but we've got to manage it when it does happen. Motorcyclists are traveling at speed and they are vulnerable to crash forces. And that mix makes it super challenging. I like to think about some different particular aspects there: sight, surface, signs, strike, and speed for motorcyclists. And this is, can we see motorcyclists? Can motorcyclists see what's coming up? Do we provided surfaces that limit the chance of crash? Are we providing signs to warn, inform, guide? And when a motorcyclist crashes, what are they hitting? And how are they hitting it? And what speed does all this happen at? And if we look at those from that likelihood severity perspective, being able to see the motorcyclists, the motorcyclist seeing what's coming up, that's going to reduce the likelihood of crashes. Good surfaces to keep that traction reduces the likelihood, and signs to warn, inform, and guide are all about trying to stop those crashes happening. When the crash is happening, it's about the strike, the severity of the incident. And speed's our magical thing in road safety because it influences both the likelihood and severity of crash. Now, my colleague Johan Strandroth over in Sweden and a few of his other colleagues from around the world actually sort of did some more delving into injury curves for motorcyclists. In the past, before they released this research, we'd kind of thought about motorcyclists as just, we said, well, they're pedestrians, essentially. That's about the forces. We're just going to say pedestrians, cyclists. This research showed that they're able to withstand more force than pedestrians and cyclists. Nowhere near as much as a car, though. Car vehicle occupant, okay? Now, I think in their research, there's a couple of reasons for that. Yes, a bit of it is associated with the helmet and the protective gear that is worn. But a little bit of it is a skewed sample, like in the sense that the population that ride motorcycles generally have a stronger stature than pedestrians overall. So you don't see old, frail people riding motorcycles, but they are out there as pedestrians. So there's a bit of a skew based on just the sample of what is out there. to move it to being able to tolerate a little bit more force. So I popped them in there for your interest, and I've popped the research paper down the bottom there, or you can have a look at that if you're really interested in the detail. Let's just jump through those S's for motorcyclists quite, we'll do it briefly, but motorcyclists can be hidden behind things. You can see here a tree, which we generally wouldn't consider a sightline impediment blocking a motorcyclist. We can see that with other vehicles. That dynamic visual obstruction is more prominent for motorcycle crashes, and shrubs and signal controller boxes and things. So it's something we need to think about as we assess the likelihood of motorcycle crashes. And of course, motorcyclists lean as they take a curve or a corner, and the center of gravity then is sort of shifted out, and the surface becomes such a critical aspect to a motorcyclist staying upright, and their reliance on that contact patch with the surface, and it's the small, two small contact patches, is so important. So motorcyclists, people refer to them as the canary in the coal mine when it comes to surface conditions, and if we see surface conditions, they're the first ones to be in big trouble. And so we want to provide those surfaces that have good skid resistance and is consistent. Now, we've got all of the usual potholes and rutting and bleeding and flushing pavements and the like, but we also sometimes are introducing these particular slip hazards, such as steel plates and things, which we would account for in a safe system assessment by saying this increases the likelihood of motorcyclists coming off, especially if that was a bit wet and at night, we would see a higher likelihood of motorcycle crash. So we use signs to warn, inform, and guide, and they're used a lot on the road network, and they help all different road users. We don't want to over-sign, and it can be an overwhelming thing and increase cognitive load and the like, but they can be effective. Motorcyclists are quite attuned to signage and out there looking and making adjustments to their riding based on the signage. So signing of the road network becomes really important. We can talk directly to motorcyclists, I suppose, using this sign, which is used around Australia, which if you've got a particular hazard for a motorcyclist over other road users, you can put this sign maybe with a supplementary plate. So it might be a surface issue that hasn't been rectified yet, and you want to warn motorcyclists of it. It's quite an effective sign from that sense. Okay, motorcyclists hitting stuff. I showed you the research, the most recent research on some of those biomechanics of injury. There are some motorcycle crash tests available. So this is the European crash test for motorcyclists into barrier systems. And I'm about to play the video. It's a motorcycle crash test dummy slid at 60 kilometers an hour at a 30-degree angle. And you do it directly at the post. And you can see that destroys that crash test dummy. That's at 60 kilometers per hour. With an underrun protection on the barrier system, it brings that within survivable forces for the motorcyclist. It is a pass in that test. It's not going to be the most friendly thing, but it is survivable. It brings things within that tolerance. So we can do a few things to start to manage the energy of crashes, but it can be a challenging task, because remember, that's only a 60 kilometer per hour impact speed, whereas for vehicle crash testing with barrier systems, we undertake those crashes at 100 kilometers per hour. So again, it's the ability to withstand some of that force. Speed like any road user, very important, and we can influence motorcycle speed through all of the same things that we've been talking about for other vehicles, through different local area traffic management, raised features, roundabouts, through speed limits, through advisory speeds, like you can see on the screen there, through lots of different techniques. And it's going to be very effective in reducing the likelihood and possibly severity of crash. But bear in mind that reducing motorcycle speed from 100 to 90, for example, well, we know that's going to improve road safety, but it's still in the territory of severity, death. We're in levels of death here for motorcyclists crashing at those speeds. So at those speeds, what we're doing is really reducing the likelihood of crash and more time to avoid and react and the like. To get things within those survivable severity territories for motorcyclists is very, very challenging. A little bit of random trivia for you. Some of you will know this, no doubt. But, this is an advisory speed, and we'd end it with a 5. And if it's a regulatory speed limit, it would end in a 0. Or that's what it should be. There's a bit of proliferation of advisory speed limits out there with us ending in a 0, but that's the convention is end your advisory speeds with a 5 and your regulatory speeds with a 0. So again, Faisal's adding some good information in there around motorcyclists being exposed to risks with compromised visibility, different light conditions, night, fog, and the like. Absolutely. And that will influence the likelihood of crashes, even though we used the word exposed in there. The exposure for motorcyclists is simply the number of motorcyclists through an area. Okay, quick quiz. 1 question poll quiz. As I check, we've covered off everything here in the notes. So here we go. A little true or false one for you. And wonderful comment in there from Sandeep around the award-winning Safe Travel in Local Streets evaluation and Wombat Crossing. So our raised pedestrian crossings coming out as the best value for investment in terms of kinetic energy in the system. So reinforcing the absolutely fantastic value of those. I'll run a raised crossing design course, actually, part of the wanting to see a lot more of them out there, and so it's just showing why we're so keen to get lots of those out there. So hopefully you can see that on the screen. True, false. If using a proper helmet and good safety gear, a motorcyclist can be considered as a passenger vehicle / car in safe system crash force tolerances. Give it another couple of seconds. I'm in an interesting view today. I don't think I'm a host of this session, so I can't see too much, but I'll give it a couple of seconds. I'm sure Loretta will help out. And let's end that poll. Let's display the results. And well done, everyone. Almost absolutely everyone. Maybe you're always a shot at saying unintelligible question with me. But that's right. We say that motorcyclists are more vulnerable to injury, to those crash forces than those in passenger vehicles who have that shell to protect and the seatbelt and the like. That being said, there's more and more vehicle features coming on motorcyclists to try to assist: airbags, motorcycle airbags, and different gear, jackets that puff up like the Michelin Man when the rider's ejected, and different things, all which sort of getting different evaluation and look the people looking at them. So we've got a little bit happening, but no, certainly more vulnerable than the cars. Okay, so I think at that point I am going to say thank you to those who came for these first 3 modules, which are the Safe System principles. So hopefully that's given you an insight into some of those, the fundamental principles of the Safe System. And if you would like to at some point come back for the final 2 modules, you'll be able to get that technique of actually doing the assessment, putting a score to some of those principles we've talked about and assessing areas. But thank you for coming along, and please keep pushing to try to improve the system out there in the projects that you're working on. Keep in contact and shoot me a message at any point if you want to be directed to research or example projects or the like. For those that are coming back for more punishment, we will be jumping into the mechanics of the Safe System assessment technique, the reporting of it, how you do bits and pieces, and we will be getting you to do your major assignment at the end of next module. So make sure you finish off that other assignment, get the quiz done, get yourself ready to go, because what is it, later this week, is it Thursday, we will be getting you into it. So Loretta, have I missed anything there?
No, that's all. You did mention the quiz, so there is a quiz for everyone today. We do have a group that will be finishing off today, but you've still got time to finish your first assignment. And those, that are finishing off doing the Safe System Principles version, you will need to fill out a feedback in the learning management system once you've completed all your assessment and 3 quizzes. And that's all. But any questions, always email me at training. But that's all from me. Thanks, Ken.
Okay, thanks everyone. Jump in to the learning management system, get yourself up to speed, and we'll see you at the next session. Or for those departing, thank you for coming along.
Thanks. Bye.